Savoca. Welcome to season 7 of DFS MVP, episode 159, the first regular season episode of the year. If you're new to the DFS MVP podcast, we're a strategy-based podcast. Every week we go over our favorite values on FanDuel and DraftKings, and then we also add in a theory segment to make you better at DFS from the macro to the micro. This week, we're going to be talking about finding week one anomalies and trends to exploit. We have a couple other DFS shows kicking off every week. Matt and I on Monday mornings, we will be doing a cash game review that will be at 11 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Every week on Saturdays, I will be coming out with a Yahoo-only DFS show with Matt Harmon. That'll just drop Saturday mornings, audio only. And then Sunday mornings, 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern time. Myself and Jordan Vanek will be in our subscriber-only Discord talking our last-minute GPP strategies. Again, that's subscriber-only, so if you haven't signed up yet, make sure you get your DFS subscription and sign up for our Discord. If you want to get a discount on that, use promo code DFS MVP. You'll get 10% off. And if you haven't signed up for Prize Picks yet, you can head over to 4for4.com/prize picks. Details on how to get a DFS sub for as little as $20. So make sure you are signed up for all of that. Before we get into everything today, I want to tell you about Underdog Fantasy. It is one of the most fun ways to spice up your fantasy football season. In addition to DFS, now Underdog has a brand new pick'em game. Just pick the over-under on your favorite or your least favorite player stats. You can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple. Use their website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players, and you can take home some cold hard cash with the code 4for4. You get $25 bonus cash when you sign up and make your first deposit. That is for first-time depositors only. The bonus cash can be used in any Underdog game, no matter how you start off. If you go to 4for4, we have Underdog picks by Zachary Kruger already up on the site as we speak. Go to 4for4.com/underdog. Use the promo code 4for4. All right, let's get into the fun part of this podcast. We've been talking preseason general theory for 5 weeks now. Now it's time for what everybody's really here for, the value plays. And like I said, every week we go over values at each position. Matt, first of all, welcome to week one. How you feeling about everything?
Well, I'm thrilled to be at this point. We finally ground down the first slate.
Yeah, man.
We got our first set of articles in. We were just bantering before the show a little bit about what a whirlwind week one always is. But it's great to be back on it, back on the grind. And let's get into some value plays. We have some crazy games on this slate. I'm really excited to get into it.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. We have a lot of, no matter what site you're playing on, a lot of value. We don't have like the crazy free squares that we have sometimes in week one, but sometimes we get like the $4,500 running back or something like that. But we have a couple wide receivers, some pass catchers that are pretty cheap. But let's start at the quarterback position. Who are you looking at in week one?
Well, I'm going to go a little bit off the wall, but you're going to hear about this game another time in this podcast. I'm going to start with Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts in this game against Atlanta, yes, he's a slight underdog, and he's playing in a dome, which we don't have to worry about any kind of concerns with weather there. But I think with Jalen Hurts, it's the rushing upside that he brings and the price discount that you get. He's $6,400 on DraftKings, and based on looking at the projection-based ranking versus the salary-based ranking, he looks like a solid value. I think this is going to be a game environment in general we want to exploit. You could even stack him with a Devonta Smith, who is at a middle-tier price this week, and you could probably get a wide receiver one out of it as well. But I will say, if you're just thinking of ultimate ceiling for Jalen Hurts, it's about the rushing, the overall rushing. And so with this great game environment and the fact that they're only slight underdogs, I think Jalen Hurts has a lot of upside here.
Yeah, I love Jalen Hurts. You talked about the game environment, and everybody talks about his rushing. What people don't talk about a lot is last year in 2 of his 3 starts, he went over 300 yards. I put out a poll on 300 yards passing. I put out a poll on Twitter who's more likely to get a double DK bonus, which is super rare. I think we had one from CMC, and then like one from Lamar Jackson in the playoffs. But I think Jalen Hurts has legit double DK bonus in his range of outcomes this week. 300 yards passing, 100 yards rushing. So I love that call a lot. The guy I'm going with, I mean, it wouldn't be a 4-for-4 show. It wouldn't be a show that I'm on if we didn't start the season with Josh Allen. I promise I won't bring him up every single week, but this week I have to. I mean, he's near or at the top of all of our value reports, no matter what site you're looking on. 8,100 on FanDuel, 7,400 on DraftKings. I've talked about all off season how important it is to target these dual threat quarterbacks, these efficient, not just mobile, but efficient mobile passers. Wrote a huge article in the off season that basically described how big this tier is of passers that are in this category, and then how big the drop off is to the next guy. So even in DFS, it's really important to target these guys. I mean, they just lap the field, and this week there's enough salary available to make it pretty easy to pay up for the mid to the high range. Josh Allen's the QB3 on both sites, and we still have like the sites. We know Patrick Mahomes is probably the best real life quarterback in football, but he's still priced so much higher than the rest of the field, and his fantasy output isn't that much higher than the rest of the field because of all the things that I just mentioned. So it doesn't make sense going all the way up, especially in cash games, and you are getting a pretty big deep discount on Josh Allen, who's the Bills have a 27-point implied point total. That's the third highest of the week. And if you remember us talking about the DFS playbook last week, that implied point total is the most relevant number when we're trying to project our quarterbacks. And even more important when we talk about how the Bills are going to score their points and who's going to collect most of that scoring, it's Josh Allen. Obviously, we know he passes and runs, but he scores a ton of their touchdowns. Only quarterback that's active this year that accounted for 75% of his team's total yards last year and over 80% of their offensive touchdowns. So I just don't see a way I'm getting away from Josh Allen in cash. Really, the only way, like you mentioned, Jalen Hurts, because he is enough of a discount there. And if you're trying to open up something elsewhere. Let's move on to running backs. I want to get this out of the way, and I kind of want to get your quick thoughts on it. Anytime we have Christian McCaffrey on the slate at a semi-reasonable price, he's probably going to be a lock. And then on FanDuel, where you're trying to get up to, you can often get up to 2 stud running backs. We're probably almost going to always have those guys as our top values. We try obviously not to be redundant on the podcast, but I think it's really important just to bring it up this week, because it is week 1. We might have a lot of new listeners. I mean, I'm pretty much locking in CMC and Dalvin into all of my cash game lineups. Are you pretty much on par that this week? And then when we do have these high priced dual threat guys that they're always going to be our top values?
Yeah, it's really hard to move away. Premium running back touches are what we pay up in salary for first and foremost when we're talking about trying to fit and create an optimal lineup. So especially with Christian McCaffrey, who catches so many passes per game. Yeah. It's a little bit different when you're talking about half PPR, and then Derrick Henry is the only premium running back. That's not what we're talking about here. These are premium pass catchers on their team as well. So there's really just no reason to fade them unless it's contest specific. So yes, we don't want to be redundant. We don't want to talk about the players that you took first and second overall over and over and over again, but it's worth mentioning if you're here for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, CMC isn't priced so far above the field that you have to really think super hard about it. We'll probably get to a point at some time in the season where he's blowing away the field in terms of salary, especially when we don't have all of the big running backs on the slate. But I mean, just look at DraftKings, 30.7 DraftKings points per game dating back to 2019. It's LaDainian Tomlinson type numbers and maybe even more. Beyond those big 4, at least the big 2, depending on who you like this week, who are you looking at as a different value at the running back position?
Well, shout out to my guy, Raheem Mostert, who didn't quite make the list, but he was on my mind, that's for sure. I'm actually going to talk about a player who I usually don't love in DFS, specifically tournaments, because him hitting his ceiling requires a huge amount of efficiency on the ground and touchdowns.
Yeah.
But it's Nick Chubb. And it's really a game theory idea with Nick Chubb this week. He's in a massive high total game. He is in a matchup against a Kansas City defensive line, which is most likely bottom 5 in the league. It is a weak spot for their defense for sure. And he's going to see very limited ownership because, like we said, we're on this slate where we can jam in 2 of these top running backs that we already mentioned. So if I'm thinking about this game environment and the possibility of Cleveland hanging around with Kansas City, it's probably through a ceiling game from Nick Chubb. And I'm just looking at his salary and seeing what he needed for him to be a really big value play, to get 3x value. And he actually hit that twice over his last 6 games after coming back from injury based on his current salary right now. So this is not out of the question for him. And this is even if they're in a negative game script. I know he doesn't catch passes. So I'm really saying I think touchdowns could happen, but Nick Chubb really looks like a value based on how little he's going to be played by the field.
Yeah, on DraftKings, I think he's pretty much out of the question as a cash game play. On FanDuel, he's priced barely as a top 10 running back. Last year, KC was a bottom 10 defense against running backs. And again, FanDuel does weight touchdowns a lot more. Is there any way Chubb ever makes it into a cash game lineup for you, or is it just a field play in GPPs?
Oh, see, I think you could do it because, like I talked about in my cash game article that came out last week, you need your high-priced players to meet salary-based expectations, not necessarily smash them. And he did hit 2x his current salary value in all 6 of his final 6 games. Just looking at who the Browns were at the end of the season, that was more indicative of who they hope to be this year. So it's not out of the question, especially if you feel like you're super thin at wide receiver as you're building out your cash game lineup when you jam in 2 running backs. I could see a situation where you move there, but it's absolutely thinner, like you said.
Yeah, it's thin, but and again, that's probably only a FanDuel play. My guy who I think we don't have projected for crazy high ownership on 4 for 4 yet, but I think when I do the Saturday sweep, it'll be a little bit higher. James Robinson, 5,900 on FanDuel, 6,400 on DraftKings. Robinson in cash games, at least, if I'm locking in the 2 high priced plays, he's actually my preferred flex. I love. I'm basically paying up for 3 running backs on both sites this week. I think that's my preferred build, and we'll get into that in the theory segment a little bit more. And then if I'm going with a more balanced build where I'm only selecting between a CMC or a Dalvin, I think he's my obvious running back too. Jacksonville is only a small road favorite. We do like to have bigger road favorites, but I mean, this is a Houston team that they legitimately might be the worst team in the league on overall, but especially on defense. They were last in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs last season. They might be even worse this year. Like, they've got rid of the few good players they even had with Travis Etienne out. I think Robinson is still in line. I don't know if he's going to get the 80% touch share that he saw over the course of the season last year, but I mean, 65-70%, which we kind of want from what we call our workhorse, is the cutoff, and I think he hits that. I know people are saying Hyde got some of the goal line work in preseason. Like, sure, maybe
that's my concern, TJ.
Yeah. I get it, but I mean, like, almost every running back, save 3 or 4 guys, is going to have some kind of goal line vulture concern, whether it's their quarterback or another running back. And I mean, I just don't see Hyde coming in and getting 35% of the work. So if I can get a running back that's going to get 75% of the backfield work as a favorite against this awful Texans defense, I'm going to take it even in cash games. And even though the spread is only 3 points, I think in a couple weeks, we're going to be realizing pretty quick that every week, no matter who's playing Houston, it's a potential for a blowout opportunity. And I mean, Jacksonville's going to want to get off to a fast start. New coach, new quarterback, a lot of new players here. So I could see them coming out hot. And if that happens, Robinson's in a really good game script. Let's jump ahead to wide receivers. For those that are new, we give 1 player at every position except for wide receivers, a little bit deeper. So we each give you 2. Let's start with a couple guys that you like, a couple cheaper guys here that you like, actually.
Yeah, and you can go to our articles, which are free this weekend, and talk and see all of the top tier players that we think are viable. And spoiler alert, it's a lot of them. But let's go down and try to find some of these wide receiver values, especially if we've talked so much about trying to jam in all these top tier running backs. We're going to have to get some value somewhere. So let's start with this Minnesota versus Cincinnati game that could easily turn into one of the highest scoring games on the slate, with Joe Burrow likely to throw plenty and at least a concentrated amount of offense on the Minnesota side of things. Well, I was surprised to see that Minnesota's defense really graded out poorly over the last 10 weeks of the season. It had the third worst defensive series success rate. That's the ability for the defense to stop an offense over the course of 4 downs. They had the third worst in the NFL, and it was the same over the last 5 weeks. So they weren't improving as the season continued. He is top 10, Higgins is, in terms of dollars per projected target, and that's a great way of finding value. And I still believe that based on the opportunity share he received last year, his air yard share and his target share, that he is the wide receiver 1 in Cincinnati, regardless of the drafting of Jamar Chase. And obviously, narrative bits aside about him dropping passes, there's a lot of uncertainty there. So for 4,700 on DK and 6,000 on draft, reverse, 4,700 on DK, 6,000 on FanDuel, you could do a lot worse than the possibility of getting the wide receiver 1 in a sneaky shootout game. He's projected consensus is inside the top 24. He absolutely has top 12 upside, and he's wide receiver 41 in salary on DraftKings.
Yeah, I was looking at this game. I obviously do the ownership projections at the side. We adjust them a lot. Again, on Saturday, we'll see a lot of changes from Thursday. But kind of going into the week, going into the season, we had a lot of hype on the Bengals, their pass catchers, Joe Burrow, obviously. And I thought that the Cincinnati side might be a side that was like a popular, cheap stack. And actually, it turned out after I did the initial projections, it's actually the Minnesota side that people are on. And that's not even weighted by Dalvin Cook. That's just the cumulative passing game. They rank pretty high. So I was kind of surprised by that. But when you use really good machine models like Kevin's at Lucal 4for4 has, he shows you things that take out your dumb bias. So actually the Cincinnati side now, after I saw those numbers, they're actually kind of intriguing because I don't think they're going to be nearly as popular as I initially thought. Another guy, this guy in a game that everybody thinks could be high scoring on both sides, you like.
Yeah, and I know a lot of the field is going to be thinking about Michael Pittman, and it's certainly a possibility. He was drafted in the second round last year. He showed flashes of why he was drafted there. He could be their alpha, but Paris Campbell, in limited usage last year before he went down with a season-ending injury, 1 game, 9 targets, 108 air yards, 28 routes run, 83% snap share. And this is a player, remember, who was uber talented coming out of OSU. He outproduced Terry McLaurin, his teammate, a 90th percentile athlete in terms of speed and burst. And though he did miss a practice, or he was limited with an Achilles injury, he's back practicing in full. And we like this game environment with the Seahawks, even if they are an underdog, with the Seahawks likely to score points and likely through the air. We're likely to have a faster pace of play, more passing plays, and that means more opportunities for these pass catchers. And with that uncertainty surrounding Indianapolis, I like to bet on Paris Campbell at 3,700 on DraftKings. He can help you get to a lot of different premium players, especially love it for that reason.
Yeah, before the Carson Wentz injury, I had looked at a couple things. Look ahead, implied point totals, look ahead lines for all 17 weeks, and then odds that futures that came out for teams that are likely to score the most points. And Indianapolis surprisingly ranked really high on both of those numbers. And then Carson Wentz got injured. Everybody cooled off a ton on the Colts. So I think they're going to have a lot of early season value in DFS. Obviously, if they go nuts this week, that value might disappear because they might end up being chalked pretty quick if they stay cheap. But this offense just in general is one that I think is going to be sneaky. And if people are targeting this game, it's probably going to be thinking it's let Russ cook time and then running it back with JT. So I like the Paris Campbell call. Anybody cheap that you want to just throw in real quick?
Yeah, with Jamison Crowder officially ruled out today, we can say that at least we know where the top two receiving options in the New York Jets offense are, and it's Corey Davis and Elijah Moore. And at minimum price on DraftKings, you could do a whole lot worse than Elijah Moore. This is a player coming out of the second round out of Ole Miss, and he's just had a ton of former players and current players just talking about how good of a player he is already. I know that's narrative based, but I tend to perk up when the rest of the field is talking about how good this player is. I think you'll see a very different offense, almost a Shanahan style offense with quick passing games, quick out passes, and Elijah Moore could thrive and get some easy PPR targets in the process.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to see the Jets logo and not be able to separate the Adam Gase the first couple weeks of the season. But this is a way different team. Traquan Smith also ruled out, so we're probably going to see Marquez Callaway's ownership shooting through the roof and him becoming a really chalky cheap play. But we just got that news right before the podcast started about Traquan. Moving on to a couple of guys that I really like. High price guy. Again, I think we could probably say Devontae Adams, anytime he's on the main slate, he's basically the CMC of wide receivers if you have the room for him. But I wanted to specifically mention Tyreek Hill this week, 8,500 FanDuel, 8,200 on DraftKings, because he is a player that I think in cash games, people are often hesitant to play because the worry is it a Tyreek week or is it a Kelsey week? And I think those concerns are somewhat founded. I did a mini study earlier this season that showed that they often do ping pong back and forth quite a bit, sometimes for extended stretches. But we added the 4for4 DFS correlation tool this season, which is a really cool way just to see. We kind of know league-wide correlations pretty well. Quarterbacks with wide receivers, opposing quarterbacks, opposing wide receivers, running backs with defenses. But on the specific team, specific player level, hard to get that data. Now we have that data available to us at 4for4. What I found, Tyreek has a crazy high correlation to Patrick Mahomes, 0.50, which is quite high, above the league average for the wide receiver one.
That's really high.
And then with Mahomes with Kelsey, 0.30. So that's like kind of what you would expect from a primary pass catcher. So basically what that's telling us is that Kelsey's much more likely to go off independent of Mahomes. So if Mahomes goes for like a measly 250 and 2 or something like that, Kelsey might still have a really big game, whereas Tyreek, typically his big games coincide with Mahomes' big games. And in a game with the highest over-under of the week, the Chiefs with the highest implied point total, a game that's really looking like it's favoring the pass game, especially on the Chiefs side, I'm really liking Tyreek and confident in him as a cash game play, especially on FanDuel where touchdowns are heavily weighted and it's a little bit easier to get to him. I really like Tyreek in all formats, and he'll be popular in GPPs for sure, but I think that he's definitely soured cash game players before, but I'm into him. We already mentioned Elijah Moore and briefly Marquez Callaway. Another bottom barrel salary receiver that I love this week is Rondale Moore at 4,900 on FanDuel and $3,000 on DraftKings. He's a top 6 value wide receiver on DraftKings according to the 4for4 lineup generator. Now, just the way salary works, like we're just often not going to see the low salary wide receivers be top values on FanDuel because you usually don't need them. On DraftKings, a lot of times they're the backbone of making your cash game lineups work. Rondale Moore is probably going to be the number 2 guy behind DeAndre Hopkins. It's AJ Green, Christian Kirk, and Rondale Moore. They spent second-round draft capital on Rondale Moore. He's a guy that Matt Harmon in reception perception called Golden Tate with a little bit more juice. And I think in a game where we're expected to see a shootout against Tennessee, we could see that juice flowing early. Tennessee closed 2020 ranked 30th in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. And those kind of stats, like looking at last year numbers, can be very dangerous. Defense versus a position. And in general, we have to be careful with defense versus position. But what we typically see is that teams on the extremes of those numbers, like bottom 5 against positions, that's usually pretty sticky. It's really hard to be pretty much the worst in the league against a position and then all of a sudden get good. The only exception is tight end often, but I don't think Tennessee has done much to expect them to all of a sudden be some shutdown defense. And I just like this game environment in general, and I like Rondale Moore because it lets me get to my expensive running backs, my expensive quarterbacks that we've talked about already.
Yeah, I love that call.
Moving on to tight ends. Again, we kind of already talked about Kelsey and Hill in that game in general, but if you're trying to save at tight end, anyone standing out to you on FanDuel or DraftKings?
I can't believe I'm here after a month of looking over these prices. I can't believe I'm looking at Kyle Pitts and I'm saying I'm a go. Yeah. I am a go for Kyle Pitts this week. Just because of the game environment. We touched on it a little bit when we were talking about Jalen Hurts. I think this is your run back option if you can't get up to Calvin Ridley. Yes, there's Russell Gage, but I'm just thinking of this in terms of who is the highest probability of being the number 1 overall tight end when it's not Kittle or Kelsey. Mm-hmm. I know that the probabilities of those two are much higher than the rest of the field, but I think Pitts has a unique amount of that probability left over. And I think we're going to see right off the bat that he has rare playmaking ability at his position, and he's going to be used differently at his position than most other or any other tight end, at least rookie tight ends. So we know it's a game environment that's conducive to scoring, a game environment that's conducive to passing. There's enough uncertainty from the rest of the field that's playing against us that people aren't going to be looking there. And even though he's more aggressively priced on FanDuel, that we might be able to use that to our advantage. People are going to say, well, he's not nearly as good of a value. We might see reduced rostership on FanDuel specifically for that reason. And if you're talking about a player who has the ability to enter the rarefied opportunity air of tight ends, that's 25% of team targets and 25% of team air yards. Only Kelsey, Waller, Kittle, and Mark Andrews are in that club. I think you're going to see Kyle Pitts enter that club as well. And I just want to do a thought experiment for 1 second. How would we think of Kyle Pitts going into week 1 if he were a wide receiver? If all we had heard out of camp is what we heard about Pitts, that he was special, he was unique, he was living up to the hype. We saw one play in the preseason where he breaks a 27-yard run. What would have his redraft ADP done? Yeah. I don't think you would have gotten him in the 4th.
No, he'd be going ahead of Jamar for sure.
Yeah, so I think that's possible. It's possible. Even though we've been talking about how he has to have basically the best rookie tight end season ever to hit, I think it's possible he starts it off with a bang right here against a Philly defense that has struggled against all positions, but most importantly was bottom 10 against QBs, and that's what I'm really looking for when I'm looking for breakout games from pass catchers.
Yeah, and this is why DFS, I think there's probably always going to be an edge, but especially week 1 in early season, like we've been spending all off season playing best ball, playing redraft, talking about guys we like and don't like, and then week 1 comes and then we like completely flip it on its head. Like 2 players that I've been out on all off season are Kyle Pitts and Mike Davis, and one guy that I've been all in on is Trey Sermon. And then week 1 comes and I'm like, give me Pitts, give me Davis. I'm on Mostert over Trey Sermon, and it sounds like super contradictory, but that's just how the nature of the beast is so different, and we do have to like remove those biases. So I mean, I'm still like not upset that I have no Kyle Pitts, but they start off week 1 in a spot that looks like it could be really good for him. So yeah, especially the way he's valued. Like, I mean, you talked about his price on FanDuel. On DraftKings, he's priced super soft, but that also just means in a couple weeks he might be up near 6K, and then we never play him again because he is slightly above average, but not great. So that's what DFS is for.
You want to ride the wave before he's too much.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to go back to a guy that you touched on, and it's just because the way we talked about a few of those cheap receivers, they just open up things this week to where George Kittle kind of just seamlessly fits into my cash game builds this week. Travis Kelce, like you can get to Kelce if you love him, but you're going to probably have to really take a sacrifice at least at your flex position. It's easier to like get the two stud running backs with a Devontae or a Tyreek, because there are some cheap tight ends like a Pitts or maybe like a Conklin. But Kelsey just kind of makes it awkward to maneuver your team in cash games, where George Kittle just fits right in. $7,000 FanDuel, 6,300 on DraftKings. Again, going back to the DFS playbook that we dove into last week, or that you can look in on the Strategy Hub, or even your FanDuel cash game article. These trends that are good for tight ends, these scoring opportunities, big favorites, high implied point totals. The 49ers, they're everything betting wise is moving in the 49ers favor, and it's not slowing down. They're up to an 8-point favorite. Their implied point total is up to 27. They started the week with the 8th highest implied point total on DraftKings Sportsbook. It's all the way up to the 4th highest implied point total on DraftKings. And I know there's a lot of thought going into the season of, can Kittle like maintain that 26-27% target share he saw a couple years ago? A lot of that had to do with the concern about Trey Lance being at quarterback. And then obviously there are more weapons, but we're already starting the season with Ayuk nicked up with the hamstring. Like, I think he's going to play, but lower body injury is never good for a wide receiver. And then at least for week 1, we're getting Jimmy G under center. So I think at least this week we still see Kittle with that huge like 27-28% target share in a really good game flow scenario. Let's wrap it up with defense. Who are you liking at defense this week?
Well, again, please go to my cash game article to talk about some of the higher floor defenses, because I'm not going to mention it here. Gulp, I say in the show sheet. I am going to choose the Falcons defense here.
I like this. I like this a lot.
The Falcons defense is more of a bet on what I'm calling an ugly shootout game environment with the Philadelphia Eagles, where we get a lot of turnover-worthy plays on top of some splash plays as well. So I want to mention that this is a tournament play more so than a cash game play. But when you rank the defenses this week by ceiling, and then you look at the comparative pricing, there is no one in the Falcons' salary range that has a ceiling score like them. So if you're looking to take down that big GPP and you're trying to fill it out with a roster that feels much more safe in the other positions, then I think you can consider getting unsafe with the Falcons. Now, one of the things that I actually brought this up, that I was going to choose this defense, to a buddy who's from the Georgia area this morning, and he goes, oh my gosh, please don't. They're terrible. And so, that was my gauge of the public perception of the Atlanta defense, that they're terrible. And then you go to the PFF unit grades, and they're actually just average in coverage, and they're average in pass rush, and they're just slightly below average in rush defense. And then in the metric that I've talked about, defensive series success rate, they're actually slightly above average over the last 10 weeks. I'm not calling this a world-beating defense, but this is not a putrid defense that the first glance at the implied total suggests to people. So I think you could do worse than the Falcons defense in a tournament.
Yeah, they're the lowest salary favorite, and they are a home favorite. And the great thing about fantasy and especially defense is, like, they don't need to be good to score fantasy points. It's not the same thing. And I think it's why a lot of people struggle at fantasy, and especially struggle at DFS, because a lot of times we're playing players or teams that aren't the most talented of the week, but that's not how fantasy scoring works. We're looking for opportunities. And I would argue that on DraftKings, they are a cash game play, because we aren't looking at things in a vacuum. On FanDuel, you don't need to use them in cash. But on DraftKings, they open up enough salary where the high floor of the other players that they might get you to still raises the overall floor of your lineup, then going up to like a $2,800, $2,900 defense. And again, I think that's again where people can really get lost that are new to DFS. You want to get every position correct. And we don't care about getting every position correct. We care about having the best lineup as a whole. And those sound like, how are they not the same thing? But they're not. Like, you just don't need the perfect defense here. So I actually would argue that they are a cash game play on DraftKings specifically. Another one that is priced low, but I think probably a higher floor team for sure is the Bills. $3,600 on FanDuel, $2,500 on DraftKings. There's not a ton to say here. We're kind of going to be looking at the same thing every single week. We're looking for favorites. Obviously, if we could pay down when possible, that's great. The bigger the favorite, the better. If they're at home, great. Bills favored by 6.5 at home. Justin Edwards ranks the Steelers as a bottom 5 offensive line unit. That's obviously a very good thing for our defenses if they can get after the passer and get sack potential. Big Ben ain't running away from nobody, so we don't have to worry about that. And then with Josh Allen on the other side, we already talked about how much we like him. If the Bills can get out to a big lead quick, that's just beautiful game environment for Buffalo. We've been talking about FanDuel with all of these positions. If you're new to FanDuel, a new fantasy player, your day's about to get 20% better. Start playing fantasy this season, and FanDuel will give you a 20% bonus on your first deposit up to $500 by going to FanDuel.com/DFS MVP. It's a big time bonus, and all you have to do to claim it is make your first deposit. We've been talking about cash games on here a ton. One of the things we love about FanDuel is the structure of their GPPs. Really high percentage of payouts. We really love like the higher stakes and mid stakes single entry GPPs. They have a ton of single entry contests that we both prefer. So I would really check those out. You can go to my Twitter or go to our Discord to check out the specific structures that we really like. If you aren't into playing the main slate games, they have a ton of other formats. They have single game, they have best ball, they have weekly snake drafts. You can play private contests with your friends. And one of the best things this week, they have opportunity at $1 million prize pool, the Sunday Million, which we covered in the DFS playbook. You can figure out how to navigate every single position if you go there. And we've already talked about our favorite values at every position this week. So sign up today, FanDuel.com/DFS MVP to claim your bonus and start playing. That's FanDuel.com/DFS MVP. Age and location restrictions apply. Bonus issued as a non-withdrawable site credit that expires after 30 days. Every week, if you're new to this podcast, after we go over our values, we look at a trend or a theory in DFS or in the NFL that's going to get you better. We don't want to just sit here and tell you who to play. We want to talk about things that are going to make you better at DFS. And going into week 1, it is the week where we have the least information. It's the week where we have no data except for last season data, which I already mentioned can be extremely unreliable. And there are lots of opportunities to exploit the field, to exploit the markets, to exploit ownership and salaries. It's the best week. If you are crazy and you think everything that we say is dumb, it's the best week to ignore it, because we don't know as much as we're going to know next week or the weeks going on. So this week we're going to talk about finding week 1 anomalies and finding trends to exploit. And Matt, I'm just going to throw it to you. What's a big point of emphasis that you pay attention to in week 1 that might not be as prevalent as we get on later into the season?
Well, it's something that I keep in the back of my mind basically as I'm doing research the entire first week of the season. Here we are. It's that Vegas and the Vegas totals that we rely so much upon as the basis of our research process is less clear about what they know about the upcoming season, about these teams. So we need to take advantage of that uncertainty when we're applying it to this game. And I think the easiest way to do that is to look at games that Vegas says are toss-ups or just close in general, and then just going with underdogs. And these are teams that we haven't necessarily touched on that much, but teams like the Chargers or Washington, really, because that keeps flipping back and forth. That is a game that the most likely outcome is a low-scoring defensive battle. But don't pretend that a shootout isn't in the range of outcomes for either or both offenses. And that is the kind of uncertainty that isn't available or isn't suggested inside of a first week Vegas total that you, as someone who's knowledgeable of the NFL and these players, can sort of take advantage of. And in the same way, the public also has an amount that they don't know, and that includes us. But you can take advantage of people's fear of the unknown I think the Rondale Moore pick, really any rookie playing in their first game, and we've had a few in this show already, is a great example of just getting out ahead of the curve, us thinking about players who are most likely going to be higher in salary because they had breakout performances. We want to enjoy that week where they get those breakout performances at low salary. And finally, we have a lot of young QBs this year, and young QBs in general tend to behave a little bit differently on the field than the rest of the cohort. They tend to run a little bit more because they're young and they usually have rushing upside, not to mention the designed rush upside from the new era of rushing quarterbacks. They also throw to their running backs and their tight ends more often because they're looking for short dump off passes. So the last thing we need to take advantage of on top of that is that they make mistakes. They make mistakes more often. And so even though Trevor Lawrence looks to be set up in a really good spot against the Houston defense, and I believe that Jacksonville is going to win that game, it doesn't mean that he's going to come out unblemished. He's going to make a rookie mistake, or one of them, Wilson or Jones, is going to make a rookie mistake that you can capitalize on by playing their defense. So definitely check out defenses versus rookie quarterbacks as well.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you said about just looking at point spreads, looking at the opportunities where Vegas might be inefficient when they might not otherwise be. I've looked at early season, like week 1 through 4 lines, and pretty consistently, especially at the top and in the mid tier, like Vegas is just slightly undershooting the upside of games. So we see games in that like 26 and up range, like kind of always go, not always go over, but consistently go over more so than later in the season. So there's a lot of leverage there by trying to target some of these teams that do have those 26, 27 point implied totals. And then because they know so little, like whoever's making the betting lines, they have as little information as they have all year as well. So they're going to lean on these teams that were better last year more. Like, it's not a surprise that the Chiefs, the Titans, and the Bills have the highest implied point totals of the week, because that's who everybody thinks is going to be the best offenses, but it doesn't always work out that way. So there's like a lot of opportunity to target those second tier of teams. You talked about the public's fear of the unknown, and there's a couple ways that I want to talk about how you can lean into that. And one of those ways is, you already mentioned Raheem Mostert briefly, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on that situation specifically, but leaning into these situations where we're not sure. And in week 1, or in any situation really in fantasy, I think you kind of always hear people, they want to say, they want to see it before they believe it. And the way that's going to play out in DFS terms is that when we have these situations like a Mostert versus a Sermon, like a Melvin Gordon versus a Javonte Williams, like the Saints, Jets, and Cardinals pass catchers, people are just going to say, I don't know what's going to happen, so I'm going to avoid it. Or we're going to have the flip side where we don't know, but people that make projections are going to be insanely overconfident, and we're going to see ownership on an ambiguous situation that acts like we know. The way to take advantage of that is to either be on the side that the public isn't on when we don't know, or just to attack those situations where nobody's going after it and say, I'm going to take my shots, and if I hit, I'm going to be able to lap the field. So, I mean, those are a few situations that just kind of stand out, but you mentioned Mostert specifically, so I kind of am interested in your take on that situation.
Well, I think here's the general rule I go by when I'm looking at ambiguity. I want talented players when they're not going to be rostered by a majority of the field. So this equation kind of changes based on rostership. If Mostert and Sermon have essentially the same rostership because the rest of the field is just looking at other places, then I'm probably just going with Mostert because he's objectively the higher projected score, and I don't really differentiate myself any further. So I just would be guessing with going with Sermon. But if there's a massive difference in how they're being rostered, how they're being utilized, then it becomes a very different equation, because Sermon is a very talented back, and we've seen number 2 and even number 3 backs in Kyle Shanahan's system just take over a game, Jeff Wilson Jr., anyone, there are opportunities for Trey Sermon that are going to occur most likely this week. But us absolutely saying that it's going to result in a breakout performance is not fair. That's just not something we're able to project. So right now, I do like Mostert better. If by Sunday morning it's very clear that he's super popular and no one's on Sermon, talk to me. I might have changed my mind.
Yeah, kind of on the same note of like leaning into those ambiguous situations. I think one thing I wrote down is I'm more willing to pay for the known, especially in cash games. And we talked about paying all the way up for these elite running backs. And the reason that I'm really likely to hit the lock button on CMC and Dalvin this week is because all of these, like, we don't have a lot of reliable spots otherwise. We have a ton of ambiguous backfields. We have a ton of ambiguous pass catchers. And in week 1, there aren't players like for wide receiver, for example. It just doesn't make sense to go up to like a 5K or a 6K wide receiver, whereas later in the year we have more information. We might be more confident in those picks. Early in the season, those high variance positions, those high variance situations, I'm just going to lean to the variance even more and then pay up for what I do know for these quarterbacks, for these running backs. When we get later in the season, we have more information. Maybe I will like pass up on a Dalvin for a Mostert in cash because I have a read on like what the situation might dictate in that backfield. But early in the season, I'm not really willing to do that, especially in week 1 when we have literally nothing to go off of except maybe some preseason, a few preseason snaps, maybe a little coach speak. It just doesn't make sense to me. A couple other ways, and these are just kind of general tournament theories, but they are things we can really lean into heavily in week 1, and it's like things like a price pivot. I mean, you can look at situations and we can have very similar salary guys with huge differences in ownership. A couple that stand out, like I already mentioned James Robinson, but again, you mentioned concerns about Carlos Hyde, and we have players around him, Chase Edmonds, Kareem Hunt, Damian Harris, like all guys that can be pretty valuable, that can have really big games, that have game scripts that play out really well for them. But Robinson's the only popular one in that price range. We have players like DK Metcalf, Adam Thielen, and Keenan Allen who are in a range around a lot of other popular receivers, and they're not, but they're all very capable. So acting like that we know what those situations around them are going to be like going into week 1, a lot there. Another situation that I think is I always kind of think about going into the year, and I want to see if you have any guys that pop to your head, but targeting redraft sleepers early in the DFS season. And the reason I say this, I know I kind of talked about like players I like and don't like with like Pitts and even Trey Sermon, but if we've been doing our homework all year and we have a pretty good idea of players that we expect to be very good in very good situations, the DFS community, either casual players or salaries haven't caught up to them. I want to get in on those guys early in the season when I can, because 1, they're going to be a better value than they are in a couple of weeks if we are right, and 2, they're going to be more popular in a couple of weeks when we are right. The most obvious guy was Josh Allen last year. If you were on Josh Allen early, you probably did really well early in the season. A guy that stands out to me this year is Tua Tagovailoa and the entire Miami passing game. They have a super low total this week. A lot of industry people have been touting him as like a guy that could take a second-year leap, including myself. They have a ton of really talented pass catchers. They have an extremely low over-under implied point total, a game that's supposed to be low scoring. And if people have been talking about like Damian Harris, I've even seen like some Jacoby Myers and not talking about Miami. So like that's one that stands out to me. Are there any like random redraft targets that you think could pop that you haven't really seen talked about in week 1?
I think they're hiding in plain sight in this podcast. I think people are still scared of the New York Jets.
Yeah.
I think people don't understand that this is an entirely new regime. And, you know, for years, we've basically been saying just get off the New York Jets offense. There's absolutely no need to look at them. We don't even need to talk to them talk about them in most of these situations because there's just no value there. But this is very different. This is a coach that was highly coveted. This is a brand new offensive mind, a LaFleur that's offensive coordinator royalty in the NFL, and there's a ton of the old San Francisco staff, one of the most highly considered coaching staffs in the league. So I think we could see a quick turnaround, not to mention the fact that they drafted good players, in my opinion. Zach Wilson has a ton of upside. We just talked about how good Elijah Moore, their second round pick, could be. And Corey Davis, if he can stay healthy, he could be a quality possession receiver for them, or an alpha receiver, with Jamison Crowder being that typical possession role. Excuse me. This isn't as scary of a team all of a sudden. I'm fine with them right off the bat.
Yeah, and I mean, again, this isn't like a GPP theory podcast, but Christian McCaffrey is probably going to be the most popular player on the slate. So flip that on its head and play the Jets. You kind of already touched on like up top of the theory segment, just leaning into things that Vegas is going to give us a little bit of leeway on, where we don't have those opportunities later in the year. I talked about it in the DFS playbook that we found this situation where games where home underdogs typically have lower scoring games, and Vegas oddly has not accounted for that. It's just this really weird market inefficiency. You can go to my wide receiver article, or I kind of retweeted the thread on it on Twitter. But I mean, basically what it means is that when we have popular teams in games where the home dog is where the home team is the underdog, it could be an interesting spot to fade. One that really pops to me is Cincinnati versus Minnesota, especially on the Minnesota side. We see them gaining some popularity as the week goes on, even outside of Dalvin Cook. And then another thing that I like to look at is teams whose cumulative ownership or roster rate doesn't match up with their implied point total. So I mentioned earlier, San Francisco's implied point totals climbed all the way up to 4th. We have them projected for the 11th in cumulative ownership in terms of their passing game. If we flip that the other way, teams whose point totals are dropping, but their ownership is rising. Atlanta, 6th lowest implied point total, up to 3rd in cumulative passing ownership. A lot of that's Calvin Ridley. And then I just mentioned Minnesota, 5th in cumulative passing ownership, down to 9th in implied point total. Another thing that you've touched on, I actually kind of want to hear if you have anything to say about small slates, but just look for overlaid special offers. In week 1, there's a lot of sites just throwing money, throwing bigger tournaments than you would usually see. There's 2 millionaires on DraftKings this week. Yahoo has their $1 million baller with no rake. So these are a lot of things you're only going to find in week 1. So we're talking about anomalies and trends to exploit. We're talking about players. These are game selection anomalies and trends. We're not going to have these overlay opportunities. We're not going to have as many games available. We're not going to have as much money in the pot. And we're probably not going to have many rake-free games. Any like quick overlay or late slate or small slate things you saw or that you're going to fire at this week?
This might be a little bit of a 2015 piece of advice, but if there are deposit bonuses on any of these sites that you get, please take advantage of that, because it's often just the first time, and just if you can max it and get that double deposit bonus, that's like winning a whole slate. That's like going 100% in cash games. That is as good as you can get. So I just wanted to add that there. In these tournaments where people get free vouchers, free tickets, I know I got a free one to a FanDuel tournament last night. You got to differentiate yourself a whole lot. I think I saw the millionaire last night on FanDuel. Anyone who got first place ended up with a little over 1K. So I would rather differentiate my lineup so that when I win alone. Although 1K sounds nice. If you are in these big free tournaments, just remember you're playing a ton of different people, and you really need to differentiate yourself.
Yeah, no, your deposit bonus advice, I don't think that's 2015 advice at all. If people haven't played, a lot of times they don't know this stuff's available. We just talked about FanDuel offering 20% back on your deposit. Yahoo's giving you a free $10. A lot of times what people don't realize, if you only play NFL DFS, if you take all your money out in February and you haven't played since then, shoot the side an email and say, hey, I'm thinking about playing on this side or that side. Can you guys do anything for me? A lot of times they'll just match your deposit if you just ask. So, I mean, the worst they could say is no or ignore you. So, I mean, if you're somebody that's playing $100 a week and you could scrounge together $75 in deposit bonuses, like that's a pretty big win. So I think that's excellent advice. Matt, that is it on week 1, man. I'm excited that we're finally into it. I hope that you and the listeners have a fantastic DFS week. Obviously, this is, if you're watching this now, it's on YouTube. Of course, once we're done, it will be on all major podcast platforms. Please rate and review on iTunes. Please like and subscribe on YouTube. It helps us out a ton. And again, if you're looking for another way to get access to the DFS sub, 4for4.com/prizepicks to get access for as little as $20. That's for new Prize Picks users only. Again, on Mondays, Matt and I will be back here at 11 a.m. Pacific time. That's 2 p.m. Eastern time to do a live cash game review of hopefully our winning lineups. You can find me on Saturday.
Come roast us if we lose.
Yeah, come chat us up a little bit and see how you did. Saturdays, Matt Harmon of Yahoo and myself will be releasing a Yahoo-only DFS pod. That'll be on DFS MVP feed as well as the Yahoo stream. And then Sunday mornings on the subscriber-only Discord, myself and Jordan Vanek giving our last-minute GPP thoughts. Make sure you follow us for more fantasy goodness. 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys in week 2.